Our reading comes from a speech given before the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. on May the 17th, 1957. The speech was by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., called "Give Us the Ballot, We Will Transform the South." And he is making reference to the Supreme Court decision in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. He said, 3 years ago, the Supreme Court of this nation rendered in simple, eloquent, and unequivocal language a decision which will long be stenciled on the mental sheets of succeeding generations. For all men of goodwill, this May 17th decision came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of segregation. It came as just a great beacon of light, of hope to millions of distinguished people throughout the world who had dared only to dream of freedom. It came as a legal and sociological death blow to the old Plessy doctrine of separate but equal. It came as a reaffirmation of the good old American doctrine of freedom and equality for all people. Unfortunately, this noble and sublime decision has not gone without opposition. This opposition has often risen to ominous proportions. Many states have risen up in open defiance. The legislative halls of the South ring loud with such words as introposition and nullification. Methods of defiance range from crippling economic reprisals to the tragic reign of violence and terror. All of these forces have conjoined to make for massive resistance. But evermore, even more, all types of conniving methods are still being used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. The denial of the sacred right is a tragic betrayal of the highest mandates of our democratic traditions and its democracy turned upside down. So long as I do formally and irrevocably possess the right to vote, I do not possess myself. I cannot make up my mind. It is made up for me. I cannot live as a democratic citizen observing the laws I have helped to enact. I can only submit to the edict of others. So our most urgent request to the President of the United States and every member of Congress is to give us the right to vote. Give us the ballot. We will no longer have to worry the federal government about our basic rights. Give us the ballot, and we will no longer plead to the federal government for passage of an anti-lynching law. We will, by the power of our vote, write the law on the statute books of the southern states and bring an end to the dastardly acts of the hooded perpetrators of violence. Give us the ballot, and we will transform the salient misdeeds of bloodthirsty mobs and calculated good deeds of orderly citizens. Give us the ballot, and we will fill our legislative halls with men of goodwill and send to the sacred halls of congressmen who will not sign a Southern manifesto because of their devotion to the manifesto of justice. Give us the ballot, and we will place judges on the benches of the South who will do justly and love mercy. And we will place at the head of the Southern states governors who have felt not only the tang of the human, but the glow of the divine. Give us the ballot, and we will quietly and non-violently, without rancor or bitterness, implement the Supreme Court decision of May 17th, 1954. In her book, Our Time Is Now, Stacey Abrams shares the story of the momentous occasion when her grandmother, Lily Bell, went to vote for the first time in 1968. This was in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And though the Voting Rights Act had passed in 1965, it took another 3 years until its full implementation was complete, and the right to vote became a reality for African Americans in their town. Grandma Bell sat in her room as everyone else in the house who was old enough to bustle about preparing to head out the door. Her husband, Jim, finally came to find her as she sat on her bed to ask, what's the matter? As she recounted to her granddaughter, she was scared. She feared what might happen when she, an African-American woman, showed up at the polling place. I'm afraid, Jim. I'm afraid of the dogs, the police. I don't want to vote, she said. Her husband was angry, reminded her of her children, of their children, and other Black children who had fought so hard for their rights. She mustered up her courage, gathered her purse and her coat, and told her husband she was ready to go. They traveled to the voting precinct together to cast their very first ballots. For decades, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 ensured that electoral practices at the state level could not be discriminatory. However, since then, many efforts and measures undermine that victory. That fear that she felt, but being able to vote was being walked back. These efforts were intentional and even went against the hope that Lincoln even spoke to when thousands of American siblings were lost in the Civil War and fighting a civil war, fighting for a new birth of freedom, that a government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. These efforts were thought to be of the people and for the people, but they were definitely not by the people. For when representatives and ballot measures are elected and passed without the majority of people voting, how can it truly be by the people? How do we have a democracy that is not just of and for the people, but by the people? You know, it takes me back to when I was a new professor teaching for the first time history and African American studies back in Rochester, New York. Shout out to any Rochesterians on Zoom today. But I was a community college professor. So I was teaching 5 or 6 classes a semester and gained some popularity. So most of my classes were full. So around 200 students a semester. I was 30 years old. I know I'm dating myself, but I was 30 years old and it was 2008. And I was not a registered voter. Why? A college professor who taught history and African American studies and was not a registered voter? I mean, every semester I taught the origins of democracy from ancient Greece all the way up to the March on Selma and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But as a Black man in this country, my vote didn't matter. Or so I was made to believe. My voice didn't matter, or so I was made to believe. But in 2008, remember 2008? Anybody remember 2008? A Black president? In my lifetime? I started to believe that in this election, maybe I did have a vote, and maybe I did have a voice. I soon really realized that I was not the only one. For the majority of my students, 200 of them, but predominantly people of color and poor people, I was in a community college, it was the same case. They believed that their voice and their vote didn't matter. So one of my students, who was 56 years old, it was the case for him. For he had spent the majority of his adult life incarcerated. And when we came down to it, he realized, wait a minute, I thought, because I'd been told that because I had served time, even though I'm off the books, I'm out of parole, that my voice and my vote don't matter. I'm not truly a citizen. But we discovered through research and digging in that, wait a minute, you're off the books. You are eligible. And all of my students, mostly of my students, voted in that election. We had all kinds of things on campus. We had a Rock the Vote event. We brought in some of the mayor. We brought in all these people, and we were celebrating for the first time that the majority of us were going to vote for the first time, including myself as a 30-year-old college professor. And I voted. And I will never forget, at 11 o'clock that evening, when they had announced that Barack Obama was the president-elect of the United States, tears just poured through my eyes because, again, I told you I was an African-American studies professor, and the next day I was going to teach. I was going to say preach, but I was teaching back then. I was preaching too. I was going to teach about how in slave plantations, enslaved women were assaulted and abused by their slave masters. I was also going to teach in another class how in 1892, the majority, like about over almost 3,000 people were lynched, predominantly people of color, and no one was ever brought to justice. I was going to teach those two lessons the very next day. Tears poured out of my eyes uncontrollably. I had no idea I was going to react that way because for the first time I had participated. And for the first time I felt that my vote mattered or my voice mattered. And the next day, all of us came in that classroom. I had abandoned my lectures and I had an American flag and I felt proud to be an American. I felt proud to be Black. For the first time in my life. Now, mind you, that 56-year-old student, he had written about because he voted too, and he had written about his experience. And his English was not so great, so he went to the Learning Center and they had helped him. And they were so moved by what he had written that they had sent it into the newspaper and it got published and they showed me, and I was a mess because I could not believe the power that he had, 56 years old, voting for the first time, being published and reaching, I don't know how many people, and inspiring them, because what he said was all of his life, he had been numb. He had felt nothing. Even when he was incarcerated, nothing. He said in this little reflexive paper that he wrote for my class that he was a year clean from crack. And he voted for the first time. And when he came out of that booth, a tear came out of his eye. I showed him that he was published. I wasn't even published then. And then he broke down because he realized the power that he had, the power not of just voting, but the power that we had. This is a sacred power that we have. And not soon after that, in 2013, rolled around, and the US Supreme Court decision in Shelby County versus Holder negated the core mechanism of Voting Rights Act for preventing voter suppression. Some have alleged that the ruling made it easier for state officials to make it harder for ethnic minority voters to vote in states like Alabama, Arizona, North Carolina, North Dakota, Ohio, Texas, Wisconsin, and these are just examples. There are so much more since then that have come to suppress the vote. The right to vote for millions of Americans are in jeopardy due to years of state and county level legislation and policies that have chipped away at ease of voter registration, access to the ballot and polling places, and the integrity of ballot counting. You know, when I was a national leader in electoral engagement in higher ed, I worked with organizations such as Student Learn, Student Vote Coalition, Campus Vote Project, the Andrew Goodman Foundation, All In Campus Democracy Challenge, working hard to overturn such efforts to suppress and discourage student voters. And the efforts of are tireless and still ongoing. You know, more than just simply a civic act, I believe, and I'm not alone in this, that voting is a profoundly spiritual act. Martin Luther King said, the denial of this sacred right is a tragic betrayal of the highest mandates of our democratic traditions, and it is democracy turned upside down, so long as I do not firmly and irrevocably possess the right to vote, I do not possess myself. Desmond Tutu also spoke of this and what it meant to him to vote for the first time at the age of 63 in South Africa. It was a religious act, he said. It was a spiritual experience, because you walked into the polling booth, one person, with all of the history of oppression and injustice and all the baggage that we are carrying. And you walk and you make your mark and you put the ballot into the box and you emerge on the other side. You are a different person. You are transfigured. Now you can actually count in your own country. You see, voter suppression laws take away something even more fundamental and much more spiritually significant than the ability to cast a ballot. Voter suppression laws are designed to take away the belief in our own power. These laws are meant to make everyday people suspicious and fearful that none of it matters anyway, like I believed when I was 30, up until I was 30. Or that the attempt to excuse the right to vote will result in an unendurable frustration, or worse, intimidation and aggression in the voting process. To defend the right to vote, then, is to defend our own power, to defend our agency, and to defend the dignity that comes from enacting one's agency and self-determination. Remember what Martin Luther King said at the beginning of our service? That what is needed is the realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. So power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. Theologian Kelly Brown Douglas speaks of a reverse of the golden rule. Do not withhold from others what you would not withheld from yourself. Again, do not withhold from others what you would not have withheld from yourself. Would any of us want the sacred right to vote withheld or taken away? Well, if it's withheld and taken away from some of us, it is withheld and taken away from all of us. If we believe as universalists in collective salvation, if we believe in shared salvation, if we believe in the interconnected web of existence that we are all a part of, then our sacred right to vote is being withheld and taken away right now. It is happening under the guise that it is of all the people and for all the people, but we know that it is not by all the people because it is not with all the people. In order for it to be by the people, it must first be with the people, which speaks of a collective effort, which speaks of a shared effort, which speaks of true inclusivity, not exclusivity, which speaks of a true democracy that we want and not the democracy we have that continues to exclude, suppress, and deny. So what can we do? Here is a message from Dr. Bernice A. King, daughter of the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
I want to take this moment to clear up any confusion that some of you may have as a result of a recent headline in the news suggesting that the King family will not be celebrating the King holiday if no voting rights legislation has been passed. Well, the issue is really not will we be celebrating, but how we will be celebrating, or more appropriately, commemorating the King holiday. So let me be clear from the outset that we will be commemorating the King holiday, and we are encouraging all of you to continue your commemorations as well. However, if voting rights is still hanging in the balance by the King holiday on January 17th, 2022, then we, meaning all of us, must collectively use our various commemorations and our platforms on that particular day to do what Dr. King would do. My father would speak and act in a way to ensure that this nation lives up to its promise of democracy by putting pressure on our United States Senate to bypass the filibuster, and instead of taking the King holiday off, they should make it a day on to pass the Voting Rights Act.
So Unitarian Universalists around the country have been taking action and calling on our members of Congress, especially our senators, to do whatever it takes to pass this voting rights legislation. And during coffee hour, you can hang out with us and we can do this together. And there's a link that we can go to, and that link will be provided in the chat now. But you can also do this during coffee hour, and it will link you directly to the phones of the senators. We are thankful that our Vermont senators have been champions of voting rights legislation that has been on the docket in the US Congress, and let's let them know that we are with them and putting democracy first and not hiding behind archaic rules that have been used to uphold racist policies. So on this Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, let us remember the spirit of love and life that fueled that movement. Let us conjure that same spirit of love and life now, in this time and in this place. Let us link arms, forming a chain of love and life that cannot be broken. And let us live our principles, let us live our values, and let us live our love. May it be so. And now join us in singing our closing hymn, Love Will Guide Us.